Hey friends, I'm Glenn Thomas, and in this video, we're going to talk about clipping versus limiting for loudness on your mix masters, what they are, how and when you may want to use them, and what kind of tonal character they might impart to your sound. So let's dive in. All right, so inside Ableton now, what you can see here is we've got just a very simple 16-bar loop going on, essentially, that we can take a listen to here. Let me just stretch this out. Let's take a listen to it. Got some simple drums, some bass, some horns, some piano. What you would call a fairly dynamic mix. There's lots of variance between high and low sounds in volume, and what we're going to look to do is bring a little bit of dynamic range reduction both through clipping and through limiting. So on my master bus here, what you will see is that I've got loaded up one of my favorite limiters, FabFilter Pro L2, and one of my favorite clippers here, Standard Clip by SIR or Sur Audio, and then also I've just got a VU meter here so that we can kind of see what's going on. So clipping versus limiting. What are we talking about when we talk about clipping versus limiting? Well, simply put, limiting is increasing the volume but decreasing the loudest peaks. So essentially you set a threshold, and anything that goes above the threshold, it does not allow to go above the threshold. It turns it down instead. But we're decreasing our dynamic range because the quieter sounds are getting closer to the louder sounds. With a clipper, the clipper says, here's my threshold. The louder peaks will still go above it, but they will get sheared off, cut off, and you will end up with a type of distortion. What kind of distortion will vary depending on the plugin or the hardware that you're using. In this case, I've set it to hard clip versus soft clip. Hard clip just absolutely shears off anything that goes above the threshold. Soft clipping will take and will cut off at the threshold, but then it'll kind of round the peaks over instead of just hard clipping them off. So what I want to do is I want to go through just what these might sound like. And so I've got it set up here so that just with my MIDI controller, I can jump back and forth between these two plugins. So first, let's take a listen to the mix without anything going on. No limiting, no compression that way, and no clipping either. This is what it sounds like. And you can see on our VU meter here, we're hitting up to about 0 sometimes. It's a fairly loud mix, but there's a good amount of dynamic range still in this. So let's go ahead and turn on the limiter. And what you'll notice is it gets louder. But then also, as you look at what's happening with the gain reduction, you can see that when those biggest points hit, when those kick drums and those snares hit, we're reducing the volume. So limiting is essentially brick wall compression. It allows only what is below the threshold to pass through, but it pushes the quieter sounds up closer to that loud sound. So you do get loudness that comes with limiting. Contrast that with a clipper. A clipper, again, is going to just shear off what goes above the threshold. In other words, it's going to distort it. And you say, wait, distortion, especially on a master bus, is that a good thing? Sometimes yes. Again, the difference with these is kind of the idea of a limiter, generally speaking, is going to be a clean type of loudness, and a clipper is kind of going to be a destructive / additive kind of loudness because we are adding distortion, which adds harmonics to our signal, which can be very pleasing. And so let's take a listen to the clipper. And already you can just hear, especially if you're using headphones like I am, you can hear the clipping happening. Switching back to the limiter. And what you'll notice if you look at our VU meter is that we've got them set pretty similarly. Looks like the clipper might be just a touch hotter. Let me bring that down just a bit here. There we go. So they are set pretty much the same. From the mix, I'm pushing 5.2 dB in on both of them, 5.2 dB in, and then it's just all down to how are they reacting and what are they doing. Both are set to 4 times oversampling, so I'm trying to get as equal as a comparison as I can here. But in essence, at the end of the day, clipping is going to distort the signal. It's going to cut off any peaks that go above the threshold. Limiting is going to compress them down and not distort them. Now, you can make a limiter distort. That's for a different video. When we're thinking about these, you may ask, when would I want to use a clipper versus a limiter? Really, when it comes down to it, the best thing that you can do when you're considering limiting or clipping on your master bus, on your drum buses, on whatever you're doing, is try it out. See which one's going to sound better. Is it going to be a limiter to get a louder, cleaner tone? Or is it going to be a clipper to get a louder, more harmonically rich sound? On really dynamic mixes like this one, where it's already a little bit of an edgy tone, it might be worth checking out if adding a clipper for a little bit more saturated, harmonically rich tone might be the way to go to get a little bit more loudness. So let's listen to that again. So you just get a little bit more harmonic richness there because of the overdrive, the distortion that's happening. Essentially, when it comes down to it, which one you use is going to be dependent on how you want your track to sound. Do you want it to sound harmonically rich with lots of kind of overdriven, distorted sounds that are pleasing to our ears? Or do you want it to be a clean, really pristine, loud sound that comes out? The fun part is you don't just have to choose between one or the other. You can, in fact, use both and get an even different sound than if you just use one. So let's do that real quick since we're comparing things here. I've got them both set up here just as they were. I'm gonna go ahead and play it back with just the limiter on. So you can see Pro L2 is the last thing in my chain except for the VU meter. But now if I actually put on some clipping before the limiting, take a listen to how that sounds. So now we're talking an even more compressed, louder sound that has both hard clipping and limiting happening. And you'll notice at the VU meter now, we've definitely given ourselves a bump up in that volume, right? Take a listen to how this sounds. Turning off the clipper. Not quite as loud, but way cleaner. Then let's toggle between the two, the clipper versus limiter. Again, it just adds that little bit of distortion. You can see the peaks that are getting cut off here. So hopefully that gives you a better idea of how these things work and when you might want to use them. I have these dialed into fairly aggressive settings. And that's simply so that it's easier to hear what we're doing here as we're demonstrating the difference between limiting, which is essentially hard compressing and turning down the loudest peaks, versus clipping, which is actually just shearing them off and distorting those same peaks that we have happening. These are more aggressive settings than I would probably end up using in my final mixes. So hopefully this was helpful for you. If it was, hit that thumbs up and share it with your friends. Thanks so much for watching, and I will see you on the next one.